From a 9-year-old boy standing over his mother's grave in the Indiana woods, to a British sword slash that hardened a 14-year-old orphan of war, to a kid locking himself in his bedroom every night reciting poetry to a mirror just to make his own mouth cooperate. This is every U.S. president's childhood explained. But first, let's go all the way back to the very beginning. At 11, at Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, George Washington lost his father and suddenly became the son who had to figure things out without the university education his older brothers got. 'Cause his family couldn't afford to send him overseas like they did his half-brothers, he ended up learning plantation management from his mother and surveying from William Fairfax instead. Chief, this guy became the most famous American alive, and he never even finished school. By 19, he'd survived smallpox on a trip to Barbados, a disease that left him immune for life and possibly infertile. Rough start, bigger ending. But unlike Washington's grinding, self-taught path, our next guy had the opposite problem. Too much school, way too early. John Adams entered Harvard at 15. His son, John Quincy, had it even weirder. By 11, he was already being dragged across Europe by his dad and told to keep a journal of everything he saw. "My papa enjoins it upon it me to keep a journal," JQA wrote, and that childhood chore turned into a lifelong obsession. 'Cause his father basically weaponized guilt into homework, John Quincy ended up attending schools across Europe and working as an interpreter in Russia while he was still practically a teenager. Chief, imagine your dad's idea of a bedtime story being, write down everything, someone will read this in 200 years. Woohoo! Diary entry number 4000. 2 overachievers, 1 bloodline, 0 chill. Now compare that to Thomas Jefferson, who grew up at Shadwell in total Virginia gentry comfort. No hardship required, 'cause he never had to fight for anything. That comfort fed an early appetite for reading, music, languages, and architecture instead of survival. His boyhood basically looks like a proto-polymath's lab. Books, a violin, obsessive self-cultivation. Not a hard-knock story, just a very expensive one. James Madison had the opposite body, if not the opposite budget. A sickly, home-educated planter's kid whose physical fragility seemed to push him harder into books. 'Cause he couldn't outrun anybody, he outread everybody, blazing through Princeton coursework at unusual speed and sticking around afterward for extra Hebrew and law study. Which is great news for me, Chief, 'cause I definitely didn't handle my own training half that gracefully. He was constantly sick, constantly small for his age, and constantly the last kid picked for anything physical. So he made himself impossible to ignore in the one arena where a fragile body doesn't matter at all: a library. James Monroe started out as just another prosperous Virginia planter's son, headed into formal schooling at William and Mary like it was the plan all along. Tutors, Latin, the whole predictable track. But then the revolution blew the whole plan up and yanked him straight out of the classroom and into the war at 16. 'Cause staying in school while the country burned down around him apparently didn't feel like an option. He reads less like a weird kid and more like a completely normal teenager whose childhood got interrupted by history at exactly the wrong moment. Chief, that's basically every kid's nightmare, except his nightmare had muskets in it. But this next one is so brutal, it turns a normal childhood into something closer to survival horror. By 14, Andrew Jackson was a Revolutionary War orphan in the Waxhaws, having already lost his father, then his brothers, then, soon after, his mother too. 'Cause he refused to polish a British officer's boots as a prisoner, the officer slashed him with a sword, leaving scars he carried the rest of his life. Left an orphan at 14, a hardened veteran at 15. Sorry, Chief, that's not a childhood, that's an origin story for a supervillain who happened to become president instead. On the flip side, Martin Van Buren's boyhood was almost comically low stakes by comparison. He grew up in Kinderhook, in a Dutch-speaking tavern, where English wasn't even his first language. 'Cause politics in that house meant just overhearing adults argue over drinks, He learned to read a room before he ever read a textbook. He's still the only president commonly identified as growing up with Dutch as a first language. What's up, boys? We debating tariffs at the bar later? These next two were deeply intertwined enough to run as a pair. William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, both Virginia boys, both privileged, but pointed in different directions. Harrison, the youngest son at Berkeley Plantation, had low inheritance leverage, which nudged him outward toward the military instead of the family estate. Tyler, meanwhile, stayed on a smooth elite track straight through William and Mary. 'Cause one had less to lose and the other had everything already lined up. One boyhood reads like a Frontier General loading screen, and the other reads like an accidental president software pre-installed from birth. Different files, same operating system, but this next childhood turns almost medical. James K. Polk spent his boyhood as a frail, chronically ill kid in Tennessee, sick enough that schooling kept getting interrupted. 'Cause his health was so fragile, he underwent a brutal teenage surgery before modern anesthesia existed. Accounts vary on the exact details, but the pain was very real and very documented. Adulthood must have felt like borrowed time. Zachary Taylor, by contrast, grew up on the Kentucky frontier, developing as more of an outdoors and fighting kid than a scholar. 'Cause there wasn't much of a classroom to sit in out there anyway, he built his whole identity around toughness instead of textbooks. A future general who never once looked like a classroom product. No dramatic tragedy, no glasses moment, no mirror routine, just a kid who grew up outdoors and stayed that way for the rest of his life. Millard Fillmore's childhood went the other direction entirely. So poor that around 15 he was sent into a clothmaker's apprenticeship. 'Cause he hated being stuck there, he clawed his way out by reading obsessively and scraping together money to borrow books. The apprentice cloth dresser story is weirdly tactile, about as far from a polished future statesman as you can get. Franklin Pierce, meanwhile, had one of the more conventional childhoods on this list. Rural New Hampshire, one of 8 kids, a father who eventually became governor. School, charm, politics, social ease. 'Cause nothing especially strange happened to him, this one's basically a transition segment. A breath between Polk's surgery table and whatever's coming next. Not much weirdness here, but stick around, 'cause the next guy makes up for it with a plot twist. James Buchanan was born in a log cabin, but don't let that fool you. 'Cause his father was actually a successful immigrant merchant. That cabin kid image quickly turns into a disciplined, upward-moving Scottish Presbyterian boyhood. Log cabin does not automatically mean frontier poverty. File that one under myths this channel just busted. Now here's the one that changes the whole shape of this list. By 7, Abraham Lincoln had already been moved out to the Indiana frontier. By 9, his mother was dead. 'Cause his father remarried a woman he'd never met. Young Abe's household got stabilized. Barely. By a stepmother who somehow held together a half-feral family living off axes, mud, and river ferries. Formal schooling barely existed for him. Lincoln himself later said his education came by littles, and that altogether it did not amount to 1 year. Chief, sit with that for a second. The man who preserved the entire country had less than 12 months of school in his whole childhood. No tutors. No Harvard at 15 like the Adamses. Just an axe, a river, and whatever books he could scrounge and read by firelight, usually by the light of the fireplace after the day's real work was already done. 'Cause paper was expensive and scarce out there, he reportedly practiced his handwriting on a wooden shovel with a piece of charcoal, scraping it clean and starting over when he ran out of room. Every other story on this list is a variation. This one's the blueprint. Andrew Johnson's childhood runs almost as harsh, just without the legend attached yet. Born poor in North Carolina, apprenticed young, with no formal schooling at all, 'cause nobody around him could afford to teach him, he actually learned basic literacy unusually late for a future president. Started life a lot closer to functional illiteracy than to elite education. Okay, Chief, we need a breather after that stretch. And thankfully, this next guy delivers one. Ulysses S. Grant grew up in Ohio as Hiram Ulysses Grant. the tanner's son who absolutely hated the tannery but loved horses. 'Cause his dad couldn't get him to love hides and chemicals no matter what, he trusted him instead with the difficult horses nobody else could handle, which became his actual boyhood talent. He got so locally known for it that when a congressman filled out his West Point paperwork wrong, he accidentally got renamed Ulysses S. Grant on the spot. Force of habit. A career built entirely on a filing error and a talent for horses. Iconic. Rutherford B. Hayes lost his father before he was even born, and was raised almost entirely by his mother and uncle. 'Cause there wasn't a dad around to lean on, that absence pushed the household toward a serious, dutiful, education-first upbringing. Not a wild story, more of a palate cleanser before the next one gets scrappy again. And scrappy is putting it lightly for James Garfield. Rural poverty, an early lost father, and a teenage stint running away toward canal boat work. 'Cause the boats were rough, and he was clumsy at first. He fell overboard 14 times in 6 weeks. A real, documented, almost cartoonish number for a future president. That instability built both manual toughness and a furious drive toward self-improvement. Here's another genuine pair. Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland. Two pretty sober, disciplined Northeastern boys. Arthur, the preacher's son from the Vermont-Quebec borderlands, actually has a real birthplace controversy attached to him. Vermont versus Canada. That's worth flagging as a controversy, not a fact. Cleveland, the minister's son, grew up under a strict, respectable household with a much quieter hook. 'Cause neither one gives you a big trauma beat. This pairing works best as a comparison of discipline versus discipline. Sir, Chief, here's another one worth pairing up. Benjamin Harrison and William McKinley. Harrison grew up as the actual grandson of a former president, inheriting political prestige before he could walk. McKinley, meanwhile, grew up in Ohio in a family that literally moved towns just so the kids could get better schooling. 'Cause one had legacy already installed and the other had to build his the hard way. This pairing gives you inherited power versus disciplined climb, side by side. And speaking of installing things, these two basically had presidential software pre-installed before puberty. So consider installing yourself as a subscriber while we're on the subject. Anyway, moving on. Now here's maybe the single weirdest kid on this entire list. As a child, Theodore Roosevelt was a sickly asthmatic stuck in a Manhattan townhouse. So, 'cause he couldn't run around outside like other kids, he built an entire natural history museum in his own bedroom instead. Specimen collecting, taxidermy lessons, obsessive self-reinvention, all stacked on top of each other. He literally called it the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. And when he finally got his first pair of glasses, he said he had no idea how beautiful the world was until he got those spectacles. Woohoo! Nature is beautiful, apparently, and also I can see it now. What a plot twist for a guy who ends up charging up hills a few decades later. William Howard Taft grew up inside a politically prominent Cincinnati family, and honestly, his childhood reads more like elite grooming than disorder. 'Cause there wasn't much friction in his path. This one's a tough sell, unless you squint and see a future Supreme Court brain trapped in a kid's body. Chief, sometimes the weirdest thing about a childhood is that nothing weird happened at all. Woodrow Wilson struggled to read unusually late and dealt with weak eyesight as a kid. 'Cause that early educational lag is well documented, it makes his later Professor President image a lot stranger than it first appears. Modern retellings often say dyslexia, but the exact diagnosis is retrospective and genuinely debated, so the safer phrasing is possible dyslexia, documented delayed reading. Myth. Gently busted. Warren Harding, by his own account, had a picture book boyhood, chores, swimming, small-town Ohio life. 'Cause nothing especially painful happened to him, printing and newspapers became his natural road out instead of intellectual torment. Chief, after that Wilson stretch, I think we've earned this one. Let's just enjoy a normal childhood for once. Calvin Coolidge grew up in Plymouth Notch, helping in the family store and on the farm. 'Cause the New England household ran on restraint and duty rather than drama, that quiet upbringing explains the future Silent Cal persona a lot better than any single dramatic incident ever could. Which is great news for me, Chief. 'Cause not every childhood on this list needs a sword slash or a stutter to matter. Sometimes the pattern is just consistency, repeated for 18 straight years. But the calm doesn't last. Herbert Hoover lost his father at 6, his mother at 9, and was shipped off to Oregon at 11 as a full orphan. 'Cause his relatives had to figure out what to do with 3 orphaned kids. He later recalled them debating not who should have to take the children in, but who should get the joy of doing it. The warmth of his early Quaker hometown gave way fast to a stricter uncle's household, where work and resilience hardened him early. Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, was an only child on a sheltered Hyde Park estate. 'Cause nothing chaotic ever really touched him, his childhood was unusually cloistered, not forged by hardship, but by insulation. The later public ease looks a lot less inevitable once you know how protected it actually was. Chief, it's almost funnier than the tragic stories, because it means the calm, confident guy America remembers spent his whole boyhood never once being told no. Harry Truman was the farm kid with terrible eyesight, thick glasses, and a mother who steered him firmly away from rough play. 'Cause he couldn't compete physically with the other boys, he leaned hard into reading and piano instead, seriously considering becoming a concert pianist at one point. Not exactly the standard childhood pipeline for a future president who will one day order the atomic bomb dropped. Dwight Eisenhower's youth in Abilene ran on chores, hunting, sports, and a serious history book obsession. 'Cause he loved history so much, it started interfering with his farm duties. His mother reportedly locked his books away at one point just to get him to focus. Chief, imagine getting grounded from history books. That's basically child abuse for a future 5-star general. John F. Kennedy's childhood is basically a long medical chart wrapped in good tailoring, 'cause he kept getting sick over and over. Repeated illnesses and school interruptions kept undercutting the glamorous image everybody remembers now. The future cool kid president spent a huge chunk of his youth as the sickly kid in the corner. Lyndon Johnson was born into Texas hill country instability. Not exact poverty, but plenty of boom and bust stress. 'Cause his mother pushed culture and his father pushed local roughness, LBJ grew up pulled in 2 directions at once, caught between status hunger and small-town grit. A kid who never fully belonged to either side of his own house, and spent the rest of his life negotiating like it. But this next one might be the most quietly devastating story on the whole list. Richard Nixon grew up in a struggling Quaker family on a failed California ranch, then behind a grocery store and gas station counter where everybody had to work constantly just to survive. 'Cause money was always tight and grief kept piling up. 2 of his brothers died young, Arthur at 7, Harold later of tuberculosis. Inside a household that carried both religious discipline and heavy emotional repression. This isn't a cute quirk story. It's chronic grief wearing a Sunday school smile. Chief, of every childhood on this list, this might be the one where the adult and the kid make the most sense together. A guy who spent his whole career looking guarded on camera started out as a boy who learned early that showing what you actually felt didn't get you anywhere good. Gerald Ford began life as somebody else entirely, Leslie Lynch King Jr., not Gerald Ford. 'Cause his mother fled an abusive husband while he was still an infant, he grew up under a different father figure and a different name altogether. And he didn't even learn the full truth about his biological father until he was a teenager. Chief, that means one of the steadiest, most boring in a good way presidents on this entire list spent his childhood not even fully knowing who he was. Jimmy Carter's childhood ran on a Georgia farm without electricity or indoor plumbing, selling produce as a kid to make money. 'Cause farm work gave him an almost comically early sense of usefulness. By 13, he'd already saved enough money to buy 5 houses during the Depression and rent them out. Sir, Chief, 13 years old, landlord. I can't even keep a houseplant alive. Ronald Reagan spent his childhood badly nearsighted. His vision later measured around 2200, without anybody around him realizing it for years. 'Cause he was functionally half-blind and didn't know it. Discovering his mother's glasses one day and suddenly seeing what he called a gloriously sharply outlined world changed everything about how he saw himself, literally and otherwise. Here's our final genuine pair. George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, same dynasty, wildly different textures. Bush 41 is the polished Greenwich and Andover product, groomed by prep school duty and a service ethos. Bush 43, meanwhile, gets his real childhood energy from Midland, Texas, oil patch informality, and loud family expectation. 'Cause one family produced two completely different environments a generation apart, this pairing lets you compare how the same bloodline can raise two very different kids. But the darkest thread on this entire list might belong to Bill Clinton. His story starts in Hope, Arkansas, then shifts to Hot Springs under a violent, alcoholic stepfather. 'Cause the house was never safe, he became the classic over-functioning gifted kid. Band, service, charm, achievement, all inside a home he couldn't control. When Bill was 4 or 5, his stepfather fired a gun during a domestic fight. By 15, Bill had given sworn testimony about the abuse and taken the Clinton surname for himself. Barack Obama's childhood, meanwhile, is a constant identity remix. From 6 to 10, he lived in Indonesia, sandwiched between a Hawaii infancy and a return to Honolulu. 'Cause he moved between so many worlds so young, he later said he was raised as an Indonesian child and a Hawaiian child and as a black child and as a white child. Catholic and Muslim schools, a white Kansas family, a black Kenyan father, an Indonesian stepfather, Hawaiian grandparents, all before he'd even hit puberty. Chief, most kids on this list had one childhood. This guy basically had 4 running at the same time. Donald Trump's childhood in Queens hits its real turning point at 13, when his father sends him off to New York Military Academy. 'Cause the family deliberately shifted him into a much harsher, more disciplined environment. That transfer, not some dramatic expulsion story, is the actual verified thread worth following here. And finally, Chief, save the best one for last. Joe Biden's childhood in Scranton and Delaware was dominated by a severe stutter and the humiliation that came with it. 'Cause classmates mocked him relentlessly, and even a nun once did too. He responded by training himself obsessively, standing in front of a mirror with a flashlight on his own face, reciting Yeats and Emerson out loud, night after night, until his speech finally became manageable. That mirror and poetry routine turns a familiar political biography into something tiny, tactile, and completely human. Just a kid in his bedroom, refusing to let his own mouth beat him. 44 different kids. 44 completely different starting points. Some had money, some had nothing, some had loving households, and some had households they had to survive. But almost every single one of them was shaped less by what they were given and more by what they were missing. And that, Chief, might be the actual pattern hiding underneath all 44 of these stories. Which is exactly why our next video digs into what each of these guys was quietly insecure about once the power finally arrived. From Roosevelt's asthma to Reagan's blurry eyesight to the stutter Biden never fully outran. 'Cause insecurity doesn't just disappear the moment you win an election, Chief. Some of the most powerful men in American history spent their entire adult lives quietly compensating for something that started back when they were 9, or 11, or 15. That's every US president's biggest insecurity explained, and trust me, it gets even weirder from here. Time equals...